second day of this seminar on spiritual solutions to material problems, or engaged Vaishnavism. I think most of you were here. I think most of you were here last time, but just a quick recap for those who weren't here, or those who may have forgotten. We started off by talking about what engaged Vaishnavism means. This is essentially an attempt to ask the question, what do we have to offer to society in terms of solutions to the problems that the world faces, that society, communities face, that we face. These problems may be, or typically are, a variety of different things, from everything from environment to politics to humanitarian things, and really asking, well, what is a spiritual solution to such problems. And in order to set the tone for that and to provide a good example of it, we started off by talking about Srila Prabhupada's engaged Vaishnava theology that he provides in the preface to Srimad Bhagavatam, where we talked about how he is addressing a variety of different political and cultural circumstances that are current during the time or around the time that he is writing the preface to Srimad Bhagavatam, and how he is directly engaging with those things, both in that preface and also in his other writings from that time, such as from the old Back to Godhead magazines that Prabhupada used to write, publish, and distribute himself. So we discussed some of the contours as an example of what engagement means. Then we talked a little bit about our own context and how this is really a concern for people today who are looking at any religious movement and saying the value of a tradition is not in its ability to help us escape, but its ability to help us engage and to provide an opportunity for us to contribute meaningfully to the world. We talked about how it's often a false dichotomy that we set up, that either we can engage or we can practice Krishna consciousness, but the two things don't go together, that engagement is somehow opposed to preaching. And here we talked about how actually, in fact, today, offering an engaged approach to Krishna consciousness is the best form of preaching, because this is what people are looking for. So in the end, one of the things we might say is that the very that the simple solution, the spiritual solution to all material problems is simply chanting Hare Krishna, right? That's it. That is the spiritual solution to material problems. But as we saw in the case of Mrigari and Narada Muni, the ideal example of engaged Vaishnavism, it often takes a lot to get someone to chant Hare Krishna, right? For Mrigari, who is not so atypical in terms of the inhabitants of this wonderful age of Kali, there's a big journey from being able to recognize that a change, a transformation is necessary, to coming to the point where it's possible to sincerely and regularly and with humility chant Hare Krishna, which is where Mrigari ended up. But he ended up through a process of real engagement that required on the part of Narada Muni a keen understanding of what his audience, what his student needed, not just spiritually, but also materially, right? And that by removing the material roadblocks, or at least by acknowledging them sincerely, Narada Muni was able to create a trust with him that allowed him to then have the faith to chant regularly and change his character. And so in order for that engagement to happen, we talked about two key criteria. One, that it needs to be authentic, and the second, that it needs to be relevant. Authentic means that it has to be grounded in our tradition, in our practice. It's not just whatever new idea or theory or philosophy is current at this time. We just find some shloka to support it. Rather, we ask ourselves, how would we begin in an attempt to contribute to the world in a truly Krishna conscious, in an authentic way as devotees? And then how do we make that authentic understanding relevant to the needs of the world? So what is the present need of human society? That's the question that Srila Prabhupada begins. And that's the fundamental question of an engaged Vaishnavism. And then, so I pointed out that the goals for today's session are for us to find the building blocks of an engaged Vaishnava theology. What that means is, what are those things in our philosophy that can allow us to have a platform, a reason to engage, and a way to do that engagement in an authentic, Krishna-conscious way. And finally, we discussed some challenges to that engagement as well. I won't belabor these, but real quick, what's the point, since everything is the material world is a place of suffering, and it always will be a place of suffering, and it's Kali Yuga and everything's getting worse anyway, so what's the point of trying to make anything better? Secondly, we are asked to not engage with the world, but be detached from it, so this seems like a contradiction in terms. A sense of karmic fatalism, that everything is meant to happen the way it's going to happen, the good is going to come, the bad is going to come, so why try to change anything? And next, that we have no social vision in mind. I talked about criticisms of that nature, that we're just focused entirely on the individual and not on society. And that too, an individual escaping this world. And finally, that our God is rather aloof in that he's always engaged in Leela and seems to be not very concerned with the problems of this world. So I mentioned all of these things only to say that they are misunderstandings of our philosophy, and yet they're important to recognize because they are challenges to things that we have to deal with, consider when we're working on engaged Vaishnavism. So yesterday I ended with the promise that today we would look at 8 building blocks of engaged Vaishnavism. 8 things in our philosophy, in our theology, that from our shastras, that provide us a foundation upon which we can, or using which, these are building blocks using which we can contribute in an authentic and relevant way to the world around us, to our communities, to our countries, and to our world. So today I want to go through those 8, and I'll move to them at a good clip, hopefully, and then I'm happy to spend time answering questions. If there's any one of these or that you want to discuss in more detail, or if there are additional thoughts or ideas that you have as well, because this is by no means an exhaustive list. It's just some things I've been thinking about during my study of Srimad Bhagavatam, but there are plenty more that are possible, so I'd love to hear from you as well. Okay, so, ready for the ride? Here we go. Okay, so the first building block is counterintuitively that the world is a miserable place. Now, remember, this was also one of the challenges. And what I want to say is, actually, it's not really a challenge, but a very useful element to engage with the world. And here's why. If you look at those people and places where there's a lot of dedication towards various aspects of improving our world, such as climate action, for example, or environmental work, you find one of the biggest challenges in these areas, if you work in them consistently, is a sense of exhaustion or hopelessness. There's actually a term for this. I think they call it climate exhaustion. And it's a sense of like, no matter how much you do, there's always more to be done. No matter how much effort you put in, you never seem to be able to catch up, to do enough. And this is particularly a disheartening situation when you think of, when your starting point is that the world is a beautiful place. I know this is something very popular in today's world. Everyone wants to say, this world is a beautiful place, right? It's all a good place, everything's good. There are some problems, but overall it's a beautiful place. And that sense it can lead to a sense of failure, a sense of hopelessness. Because when that's your expectation, then you're always going to fall short. And Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, he makes no such promise. The Vaishnava tradition, the Hindu traditions, the Indic traditions in general, including Buddhism and Jainism, actually make no such promise. This is one thing they all agree on. That no matter how hard you try, this world is still going to be a problematic place. And therefore, appreciate your victories when you have them. Because your goal is not perfection here. Your goal is not to make everything a beautiful place. There's going to be no second coming, no great apocalypse. There's going to be no transformation. Satya Yuga will come along, but it's way down the road, right? 427,000 years left. So this actually, when used properly, is a reason for hope, right? It's a reason to recognize that, yes, we can put in effort and things can get better, but it's okay if we're not eradicating the problem, because we actually can't. And even though we can't, it's still our duty to try. And here's why. Even though this material world is going downhill, and it always has and it always will, still that doesn't prevent Krishna from coming along and trying to fix things, right? And the idea of an avatar, or an avatar theology, is one of the most valuable building blocks that we have for engagement. That our God, far from being aloof from this world, is constantly appearing whenever there is some kind of social problem, right? Yada yada hi dharmasya glani. Dharmasya glani means, typically this means a political problem in the leadership of the world. That's the external reason for it. I mean, of course he comes for his devotees and he comes internally to enjoy his pastimes. But when it comes to a reason for entering this world, he says dharmasya glani. And that usually means that there's a problem with leadership. Krishna needs to replace someone who is not ruling the world properly, who's not doing things the right way, and therefore causing all kinds of suffering to the living entities. Whether we look at the example of King Vena, or we look at Hiranyakashipu and Hiranyaksha, or we look at Ravana, or we look at the challengers of Indra. Indrari vyakulam lokam mridayanti yuge yuge. Right? He comes to fight specifically the enemies of Indra. And it's not because Indra is his favorite devotee necessarily. Perhaps he is. But the reason he's coming to Indrari vyakulam is because vyakulam lokam, right? The world is miserable, is vyakula. Because Indrari, the wrong leadership, is at the top. Right? So Krishna comes to this world explicitly for political reasons. And even he does this over and over again, even though he knows that it's going to keep getting worse. I have often thought about this question of, in Bhagavatam it's described Krishna's beautiful pastimes when he appears in this world at the end of Dwapara Yuga. And literally the moment he leaves, dharma jnanadibhi saha kalo nashtadrishamesha. The moment he leaves, everything starts spiraling downward. Like dharma and jnana are gone, and leadership goes downhill, and Kali Yuga begins. And I would often wonder, why? What was the point of doing all this? You put in all this effort and you arrange to destroy adharma and establish dharma, and within 15 minutes of leaving, everything is back downhill again. Because for as long as it lasts, it's worth it. If we can help this group of devotees, or this group of living entities, very broadly speaking, humans, animals, whoever, and the world becomes a joyful place, and as a result of that, people are able to practice Krishna consciousness, then it's worth it, even if the overall trajectory is downhill. And if it's worth it for Krishna, then it's worth it for us. If this kind of work is good enough for him, then it is good enough for us. And we see this example in the people who appear with Krishna. Whenever Krishna appears, all the demigods come with him, right? They all appear with him. Because it's a team project. It's a collaborative effort to try to fix this world, to help people. And we too can participate in that collaborative project. Right? We too, the demigods come down, his devotees come down, everyone comes to help Krishna in this fixing of dharmasya glani. And so we too can participate in that process, in that practice. Okay? So these are the first two, is to recognize, actually, to be honest, the world is a miserable place, but it's still worth our time and energy, because every living being is worth our time and energy. No one is too small or not worth it for the devotee to help. Not even a little animal with broken limbs, as we saw in the case of Nagamuni and Mrigadi. Now, before we get too depressed about the nature of the world, even though this world is a miserable place, there is something very uplifting about this world. And that is this aspect of our philosophy, namely that the world is non-different from God. This is something very special we have. There are some philosophies, some religions, which insist that there is a very big gulf between creator and creation. God is way up there, the world is down here. God is all good, we are all sinful. Therefore there's a big gap, right, between him and us, between creator and creation. There's other philosophies that argue that this world is actually Maya, it's false, it's mithya, it's not real, because it's merely meant to trap us, that's all. But Vaishnava philosophy accepts neither one of those. The world is in fact non-different from Krishna because it is Krishna's energy, it is his Shakti. And you know that famous pair of Achintya Bheda Bheda, which is Mahaprabhu's philosophy. Inconceivable difference and non-difference at the same time. We emphasize the difference for good reason, right? That there is a difference between Krishna and his energies, between Krishna and the world. But we often forget the other half, which is that there is non-difference as well. There's unity, there's oneness, because this is Krishna's energy. And that other half, the non-difference, is very useful when we are looking at the world and we're saying, what is there that we can help? What is there that we can contribute? This world has value. Why? Because it is Krishna himself. It is non-different from him. In fact, in the Sandarbhas, Srila Jiva Goswami, one of the great acharyas of our sampradaya, the preeminent philosopher at the beginning of our sampradaya, he spends as much time on the non-different side as he does on the difference in his Sandarbhas. He's not emphasizing difference and ignoring non-difference. Both have to be held equally, he says. Both are equal partners here. So, if I ask you to think about this, what is there in our philosophy, in our shastras, that points to the non-difference between Krishna and this material world? What could you say? What aspects, what chapters, what books, what stories, what indicates that non-difference? How can we speak about that? Think of the Bhagavad Gita particularly. Yes? Yes. Yes, Krishna spends a whole chapter, actually 2 chapters, chapters 10 and 11 in Bhagavad Gita, demonstrating that the entire world is his body, right? That everything is contained within his form. And that he can be seen and found in every aspect of creation. I am the light of the sun and the moon. I am the taste of water. Right? He says, he talks about rivers and oceans and mountains, good and bad, everything. We can find Krishna within it.
Maya Dakshina Prakriti.
Yes. And then he talks about how he is, this whole Prakriti is going under his direction. Right? He's the one who's leading it. If it had no value, if it was worthless, why would Krishna take the time and energy to direct it, to care about it? So this half of our philosophy is often ignored. And I think it's important that we utilize it, because it's the other half and it ought not to be neglected. It's very powerful for this purpose of asking, how can we engage? One of the other particular aspects of our philosophy that of Vaishnava Vedanta is that we regard Krishna not only as the instrumental or efficient cause of this world. Not only does Krishna create the world, like a child makes, a building out of Legos. Right? Krishna is not only creating the world, but he is also the substantive cause. He's also the substance of the world. In Sanskrit, this means he is not only the nimitta karana, but also the upadana karana. And again, this is not something everyone says. This is something very special about Vaishnava Vedanta that we need to reflect on and value. That Krishna is the stuff of this creation. He's not just the one who sets it into motion, like Mahavishnu sleeping and breathing out the creation. No, he enters every piece of that creation over and over again. Right? He comes into the material world, the material cosmos, as Mahavishnu. Then he breathes out the universe, then he enters every universe as Garbhodakashai Vishnu. Then he enters the heart of every living being in every atom as the Antaryami, as Kshirodakashai Vishnu, as Paramatma, guiding every living entity. So he's right there. Right? He is the stuff of this world as well. Okay, so 3 building blocks so far. Right? The world is a miserable place, is a building block, not a problem. Avatar theology, even though it's miserable, it's good enough for Krishna to fix, to try again and again to fix it, and to ensure that all his devotees from the spiritual world and lots of demigods from the heavenly planets come join him to fix it. So it's an open invitation. We can collaborate as well. And thirdly, that even though the world is miserable and it needs fixing, it's still so valuable because it is not illusion, it is not completely different from Krishna, it is actually non-different from him, even though it is also different. Okay. The world is non-different from God, and the God that it is non-different from is a very special kind of God. Far from being aloof, Krishna is a deeply personal deity whose primary quality, whose most important quality is his relationality, is the fact that he is willing and able to engage in relationships with every living being and in every kind of relationship imaginable. When Srila Rupa Goswami, at the beginning of Nectar Devotion, Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, when he's asked to define, when he tries to define who is this God that we worship, who is this God that he's going to write this book about, he defines him. He could define him in so many ways, right? The Upanishads say, Satyam Jnanam Anantam Brahma. Brahman, the absolute being, is truth, Satyam, Jnanam, knowledge, Anantam, infinity. He could define him like that. He could define him as Aishwaryasya Samagrasya Viryasya Yashasas Shriya, that he is full of all 6 opulences of wealth and knowledge and renunciation and beauty. These are the classical definition of God. Omnipotent, omniscient, right? What is it? Omni-beautiful? I don't know. Omnipresent, right? We have all these omni words, but he uses none of them. He actually uses a different kind of omni word. The word omni can be translated in Sanskrit as akhila. Right? Akhila means everything or all. He says, no, Krishna is omni-relational. Akhila rasamrita murti. Our God is the one who is the very fount the very embodiment of all relationships, of all rasas, of the joy, of the nectar that comes from those relationships. Now, one of the characteristics of relationship, perhaps the most important characteristic of a genuine relationship, is that we are willing to make ourselves, make ourselves vulnerable to the other person in that relationship. Vulnerable means that we are willing to take joy in their happiness and take suffering in their suffering. That we open ourselves to being both pleased and hurt through the other person. That's what a relationship means. Just like I can have a great conversation with someone on the street. I can teach my students. I can work with my colleagues at work. None of that counts as a relationship except in a very minimal sense of a transactional relationship. Right? You sit in my class, I give you a grade. It's a very transactional sort of thing. The moment that their happiness and distress start mattering to me, that's when you know that there's a real relationship blossoming. And we know this in the closest relationships we have, right? That when we have a real relationship, that person's pain hurts us more sometimes than it hurts them. Right? And if you're a parent and you've had small children before, you know this experience, right? That sometimes if they come back in tears because someone has hurt them or bullied them or whatever. And the burning you feel inside is sometimes worse than the burning they feel. They tell you all about it and then they go off and play. And you're so like, oh my gosh, where's that kid? It's really intense. Or hunger, right? Or physical pain. That's called vulnerability. That's called relationality. That's called empathy. So does Krishna suffer with us? Well, on one level, no. Krishna is beyond all suffering. Right? He is Sat Chit Ananda. And the Upanishads say clearly, Anandam Brahma. The fundamental definition of Brahman is he's always joyful. So on one level, no, Krishna never has a broken bone. Krishna never dies. Krishna never is hungry. On the other hand, because he is so deeply connected in relationship with his devotees, and his devotees go through the full spectrum of pain and pleasure. We know this from the Pandavas, we know it from Queen Kunti, we know it from Gajendra, we know it from everyone in Bhagavatam. They go through the full spectrum, therefore Krishna feels it. And for someone who is truly all-knowing, who knows everything, is there really a difference between experiencing something and empathizing with something? Empathy for us means we're feeling something, but we're not quite there. We don't know everything that person is going through, right? You're struggling with something, you tell me about it, I try to empathize. I feel something, but I can't truly know because I've never had that experience, so how could I know? But Krishna is all-knowing. He knows everything. Therefore, he is called Jagat Antaratma. Right? He is the soul within the soul. He is the very life of life itself. Antaryami, the inner controller. And he says in Bhagavad Gita, Upadrashtanumantacha bharta bhokta maheshvara paramatmeti chapyukto. That there's this Paramatma in the heart. That's me, Krishna is saying. And I'm seeing everything. Bhokta. And I'm also experiencing it. Not directly, but pretty close. Right? Because I know everything. In fact, there's this very nice verse later on in the Gita where Krishna says, one who does austerity like the demons, demoniac austerity. Demoniac austerity, he says, is one that tortures the physical elements of the body and the supersoul within. Even the supersoul is being tortured by austerity that is done for the wrong reasons, whose goal is just to give pain. That's masochistic in nature. Krishna is saying, that even hurts me. Right? So on the one hand, no, Krishna doesn't suffer. On the other hand, he suffers the most when his devotees suffer. And we see this over and over again in Srimad Bhagavatam. Krishna constantly running to help his devotees, and constantly feeling their pain, and constantly suffering their suffering. Right? When Haridas Thakur is beaten in the marketplace, and when his devotees are hurt. So yeah, Krishna is our God is a very personal God. And again, this is something that we ought to be proud of and utilize from Vaishnava theology, from the Vaishnava tradition. Because not every tradition has this understanding of God. Our God is not aloof. Maybe the God of philosophy, maybe the God of the Upanishads, but not the God of Srimad Bhagavatam. He's right there with his devotees, feeling their joy and their suffering, both. Okay, so you take these two things, okay? The world is non-different from God, and God is personal. And you put them together, and what you get is, if the world is non-different from God, and God is a person, therefore the world is personal. And this is where we really come to the fruition of an engaged Vaishnava theology. The world is a personal place. What does this mean? It means that everywhere we look and everywhere we go, there's always a person within and behind all things. One of the beautiful aspects of Srimad Bhagavatam about Vaishnava culture is that everything is personal. The rivers are goddesses. The trees are people, demigods and demigoddesses. The mountains are alive and personal. The wind and sun. And all of these things, to a modern mind, can sound like, this is all really mythology, isn't it? The primitive forms of thinking. There's a sun god and a wind god, and like Mount Olympus and the Greek gods. And so this is really backward. But I would like to submit to you that far from being backward, this is actually the heart of what we need in order to care for our world, to engage with it, particularly in the area of environment, in the area of ecology. Over and over and over, studies have shown that the only way you can exploit anything is to depersonalize it. Studies of meat eating have shown this as well. Right? That the only way you can take an animal, when I teach vegetarianism, I do it in the section of my world religions class where we talk about Jainism, because the Jain tradition has a wonderful, wonderful long history of non-violence towards animals. And I ask my students to consider this. I say, there are places, I start actually like this. I say, there used to be in the United States several slaughterhouses that were specifically dedicated to slaughtering horses. Because in Canada, parts of Canada, and in parts of Europe, people enjoy horse meat. And universally, my students are, they're disgusted by this idea. They're deeply troubled. Like, how could anyone do something so horrible to such a beautiful animal? And then we talk about the fact that there are cultures that eat dogs. And it's not an unusual thing or a weird thing. And again, they're universally horrified by this idea. And then we talk about, well, what is the difference? Why is it that a chicken or a goat or a cow doesn't elicit that reaction and a horse or a dog does? And of course the reason for that is because we choose to personalize certain animals, right? A dog has a face and feelings and a personality. And horses, we envision ourselves, every little child's dream is to get on a horse and ride it, ride it through the countryside. That's the vision of our fairy tales. That's the stories we tell. Not of us eating the horse, right? Because the horse is a person. So when we personalize something, then it becomes very difficult to exploit it. And when we depersonalize it, that's a prerequisite. Even on the battlefield, governments must ensure that soldiers are able to depersonalize the people they are shooting at. Otherwise they can't do it. They just can't, right? They have to see those as less than human for some reason or some capacity. Otherwise a human being can't shoot someone with another face, right? So in Vaishnav tradition, Vaishnav culture, that personalization we have such a radically personal tradition. We don't always live up to it. We try. But our philosophy is so deeply personal in nature that not just dogs and horses, but every living being and every living thing, and even things that we don't think are living, like mountains. You know, in Bhagavatam it describes mountains had wings. It sounds like the most ridiculous thing, but it has something of great value within it. It reminds us that everything is worth a relationship. And as soon as you engage in a relationship with it, it becomes very difficult to exploit it. There's a very nice story in this regard in Srimad Bhagavatam about the Prachetas. They were 10 brothers, and they were asked by their father, what was his name? Prachinavaisha. They were asked by their father to perform, to populate the world and to rule it. Right? They were one of the original progenitors. And in order to do that, they had to prepare themselves, right? Again, they were given a mission for engagement with the world. Their job was to help the world by settling it. So they were given this mission, but they needed to prepare themselves spiritually. Again, spiritual, material, they go hand in hand in Bhagavatam. So they go into a body of water, a large lake, and they meditate for 10,000 years. And Lord Vishnu, they meditate using a mantra given to them by Lord Shiva. Then they emerge, they have darshan of Lord Vishnu. They receive everyone's blessings, they feel empowered, and they come up onto earth in a mood of great friendship with each other and a great desire to serve. And what do they find? But the whole world is overrun by trees. It's completely a jungle with not an inch to walk on or to live on. And their job, it was to settle this world, to populate it, to create space for human habitation. A very different kind of problem, mind you, than what we have today. Where we're trying to desperately preserve forests and keep the Amazon. At their time, the whole world was the Amazon. And they were going, where do we live? Because these trees are so big. So they get angry. They get angry because they're not able to do the service they've been asked to do. And so they emit fire from their eyes through yogic energy, and they burn the trees to create space. And they burn, and the Bhagavatam says they are determined to burn every last tree on the surface of the earth. So great is their anger. And at that point, Lord Brahma has to come and intervene. And he says, Bhagavatam says, he explains to them logically, what are you doing? You don't need all this place. You need some space. So clear some land, but don't destroy all the trees. And of course, they're sages, and they're very reasonable and understanding. And so they accept what Lord Brahma says. But just to ensure that this doesn't happen again, Brahma takes it one step further. Not only does he explain it to them by logic, but he also asks the trees collectively to give their daughter in marriage to the Prachetas. Her name is Marisha. And there's a long story of how she becomes the daughter of the trees, right, of the forest. Now, what happens? Not only logically does it not make sense anymore, but at this point, they have a relationship, right? There's a relationality with the trees. Now you're not only destroying other living entities, which is not good and causes bad karma, but they're your father-in-law. And you're not going to destroy your father-in-law if you want a happy marriage, right? So all of a sudden, the whole thing is personal. And that personalization is the heart of how a Vaishnava sees this world. Not just as resources. We talk about resource management. No, it's not just a resource to be managed. It's a person to have a relationship with. There's one professor named David Haberman, who's now recently retired from the University of Indiana, Bloomington. A very wonderful person and a good friend as well. And he has written a series of books on Vrindavan, on Braj. His first one was on the Chaurasi Kos Parikrama, the 1 month long Brajamandal Parikrama, the walk around Braj. He wrote a book then on the Yamuna, talking about the pollution and the sacredness and the pollution of the Yamuna. It's a very beautiful book. It's called River of Love in an Age of Pollution, where he talks about the glorious identity of Yamuna Devi in Krishna's Leela, in the lives and the stories of Braj, and the lives of the people there, the Brajvasis, and then he talks about this modern reality. And then he wrote a book on Govardhan called Loving Stones. Loving stones. These are stones who love and stones who are loved. He also wrote another book called People Trees. The word people is the English word, trees that are people. And at the same time, there's a special tree in India called the peepal tree. And so it's a play on word. People trees. And in that book, he says that he traveled the length and breadth of India to study the practice of tree worship. And everywhere he went, he asked in the local language, he asked, Ye vriksh kaun hai? Which in English means, who is this tree? He said not once did anyone say, what? What do you mean? Did you mean, what is this tree? Ye vriksh kya hai? No one asked him that question. It was the most natural question in the world. And everyone knew that he wasn't asking about the botanical Latin name for that tree. Oh, this is the fig tree. No. Ye vriksh kaun hai? Who is this tree? Because everyone understood that there's a person here. Perhaps you've visited India before and you've seen sometimes trees in the weirdest places, growing out of the middle of someone's home or in a very odd place in traffic. And almost always, that tree is there. And you look closer, there's a face on it. Right? Someone has put the face of a Devi Devta, some clothing, some sari on it, some puja. And as soon as you personalize it, now you can't cut it down. Right? You can't cut it down. In fact, in many of the environmental movements in India, this was one of the most important pillars of that, is the personalization, the reminder that these are persons. So one of the things David Haberman says, and I think this is a very valuable point, it's a little technical, but it's very powerful, I think. He says there are two types of ways of looking at this world. One is anthropocentrism, and the other is anthropomorphism. Okay? Anthropocentrism means that we feel that human beings, anthropos, is at the center of this world. This world is given to us as our dominion to enjoy and exploit as we like. And anthropomorphism means that we see the human being in everything, a human face in all things. Now, one of the things he talks about is that historically, anthropomorphism, that means in colonial times particularly, anthropomorphism was the definition of the uncivilized savage. These uncivilized people, Hindus, but also indigenous communities around the world, Native Americans, Australian Aborigines, traditional cultures in Europe also before the modern period. All over the world, people have seen the natural world in personal ways. And what this modern culture has taught us is to say that is a symptom of savageness. That's a symptom of primitiveness. All this mythology. These are persons? What do you mean? Right? No, rather it's the human being. And God has given man dominion over animals, plants, and this entire world. Right? This is often how, in the past, Christians have interpreted the beginning of the Bible, the story of Genesis. That God created man, and then he gave human beings the world as their dominion. Now, most Christians don't see it that way. But historically, this has been a big problem, particularly in colonial times, that man is the center and we get to exploit everything else. Whereas those people are anthropomorphists. They're primitives. They see personality in places where there isn't. Haberman says, in fact, it's the opposite. What our world needs is less anthropocentrism and more anthropomorphism. Let's put faces, he says, that is personhood, on all things. And he gives not only people trees, but particularly Giriraj as an example of this. Right? That the lowest of all things in the eyes of a human being is a rock. Right? It's a rock. And yet, from the vision of a Vaishnav, a rock is not a rock. It's Shalagram. It's Giriraj. It's Shivalinga. And by extension, every rock has the potential to be Murti, right? To be the form of the Lord. Marble or granite or metal or whatever. That Krishna can inhabit and does inhabit everything in creation. So the world is a personal place. And that personality, that personal quality is the foundation for relationality. And relationality is the foundation for care once you see them as persons. Okay. So far, we've been looking at those aspects of our theology that are macro in nature. They're big questions or ideas about the world as a good place or a miserable place, about the Lord coming as avatar, as the world is not different from God, as God is personal and the world is being a personal place. These are all macro pictures, building blocks that are useful for talking about the world as a whole. For the last three, now let's turn to things that are more individual and to more personal. What are those personal aspects of our theology that can encourage us to engage and can give us the foundation, the motivation to engage with the world? Let's move from the global, in other words, to the individual. I think it's fair to say that for Vaishnavas, engagement begins with a transformation of character. This is something that is well attested in also the scholarly literature surrounding engagement, particularly in the area of peace studies. That there can be no external peace. We cannot create external peace until there is internal peace. And the way that the character of a Vaishnava is described, the 26 qualities of a devotee, but especially the idea of para dukkha dukhi, that a devotee suffers to see others suffering. Not only does he do unto others as you would do unto yourself, right? That's often called the golden rule, and that's there in Bhagavad Gita also, where the yogi sees all living entities like himself. But perhaps even a more fundamental way of connecting with the world is not in terms of the good things. I like this, so I want you to have it too. But in terms of others suffering. That a Vaishnava looks at another person suffering and says, that suffering makes me unhappy, and their joy makes me happy as well. And we saw this very wonderfully in the example of Narada Muni yesterday when we talked about the story of Nagari, where this was the main reason that motivated him to engage with the situation, both initially out of compassion for the animals, and then out of compassion for Nagari himself. I made this point yesterday, I started making this point, which is that a Vaishnava, for a Vaishnava, we take the regular moral qualities that are present in this world, that are good, and we feel impelled to add something to them, to improve upon them. And what I mean by this is, I think yesterday I talked about the idea of ahimsa, or non-violence, right? Ahimsa is described in Bhagavatam as samanya dharma, as that which is dharma for everyone. But for a Vaishnava, ahimsa is not enough. Ahimsa means don't injure others, and that's a good thing. But a Vaishnava tries not only to avoid injuring others, but to actively helping them, right? And that quality is called karuna, or compassion. There's a difference between ahimsa and karuna. You can be non-violent and be inactive, but you cannot be merciful and be inactive, compassionate. Ahimsa can lead to inaction. Karuna requires action. And we talked about this yesterday in terms of the devotee leaving his path, right? Not staying in your lane, right? How Prabhupada didn't stay in his lane, how Narada Muni didn't stay in his lane. Staying in your lane, ahimsa. Leaving the lane, karuna, compassion. Dharma is another one. Dharma is a foundational aspect of human life. It's what makes us human. Do your duty. Do what you're supposed to do. That's good. That's righteous. A devotee says, dharma is good, but it's not enough. You can do your duty and be selfish. Instead, we say, let's improve on dharma with the idea of seva. That not only am I going to do my duty, but now I'm going to do more than my duty. I'm going to serve. Because when I engage in service to Krishna and to all living entities, then that service is something that I'm not required to do. Seva is not a requirement. Seva is a step beyond the requirement. Karuna is not a requirement. It's a step beyond the requirement. So when we talk about engagement begins with a transformation of character, yes, we're talking about morality. There's no character without morality, without ethics. But from a Vaishnava perspective, we're building upon that. We're saying, yes, we're required to be moral, and yes, we need to be more than that. We need to take a step beyond it. Okay. Number 7. There's 8 in total. This is an ashtaka. Seventh one. This, remember, yesterday, I ended by saying this is one of the big challenges. of engagement. If we are asked to be detached from the world, why should we engage with it? Since engagement requires some level of care or attachment, shall we say. And aren't we said that we should practice vairagya? We should at least move in that direction? Yes. But here's the great secret of Bhagavad Gita, really. But it emerges very nicely in Srimad Bhagavatam in really practical ways. These scriptures tell us that there's a paradox here. The person who is detached from the world is in the best position to be engaged with it. The person who is detached from the world is in the best position to help the world. Because so long as you're attached to the world, you've got something personal to gain or to lose. So how can you genuinely help? You can help to the extent that you're able to put aside your selfish desires. But one who has been able to detach, that is, to put aside selfishness, now they can truly help with selflessness. And a wonderful example of this comes from the story of the Dhyiti Muni in 6th canto of Bhagavatam. Perhaps you remember this story. The Dhyiti was a great sage, and the demigods were being tormented, or they were afraid of this Vritrasura. And they needed to figure out what to do. And Lord Vishnu tells them that the only way Vritrasura can be killed, who actually in the story he's actually a great devotee, but anyway, from the perspective of the demigods, he's a problem. So the only way he can be killed is if you make a weapon out of the strongest material available, the toughest material. And as it turns out, the toughest material available are the bones of the Dhyiti Muni, which have been strengthened by the tejas, the fire of yoga. So they are as strong as thunderbolts. And therefore from these bones, Indra creates his vajra, right, his thunderbolt weapon. So off they go to the Dhyiti Muni, and they say, my dear sage, we need your bones. And he says, well, yeah, maybe not. He says, no, I'm not going to give you my bones. I want to live. Everyone's life is dear to them, and there's nothing wrong with self-preservation. You can't help the world if you don't help yourself first. So, no thank you. And the demigods become panicky because they can't force him to do this. He's a great sage. And sages have a lot of Shakti. I mean, after all, he has these bones. Right? So they're very worried. What should we do? And so they beg him again. And it turns out that Dhyiti Muni is just teasing them. And finally he turns around and he tells them what he really thinks. He says, we come into this world completely indebted to others. Right? All the debts that we have. To our parents, to our forefathers, to the demigods, to the Lord, to the great sages of the past who give us knowledge, the demigods who give us rain and sunshine and wind, to the ancestors and parents who have given us birth and life and culture, to the shastras that give us teaching. And we come in this world indebted to others. Our very life, our very body is meant for the welfare of others. Of course you can have my bones. I'll just go get another body. Right? And the reason he can shrug it off and truly do something to help the universe is because he's completely detached. Right? He's able to be engaged only because he's disengaged. He can be attached because he's detached. He can serve because he has nothing to gain or lose. And this engaged detachment, in one word, is called in our philosophy Yukta Vairagya. Yukta Vairagya. Vairagya means detachment, and Yukta, Yukta has many meanings. So one way to translate it, Yukta can mean proper or right. So proper renunciation. But Yukta, the root of that is from Yuj, which means to connect, to link, to engage. Right? Yuktasya bhaktam chaniyunjatopi vande guru shri charanaravind. We sing every morning. That the spiritual master becomes very pleased seeing his disciples, his students, engaged in the service of the Lord. Yuktasya bhaktam. Right? They're yukta, they're engaged. So this word yukta means engagement. So engaged Vaishnavism, newfangled term? No. Engaged Vaishnavism, this is yukta vairagya. That's all it is. It's being detached so that you can find the right way to help the world. This is the only reason Vaishnavas take sannyas. Traditional forms of sannyas in India, you cut off your Brahman thread, you cut off your shikha, and you perform your own funeral rites, not literally, but metaphorically, before you take sannyas. You are dead now to the world. And Vaishnavas don't do that. Because they say, Vaishnava sannyasis, they say, why should I be dead to the world? My purpose is to serve the world. How? Through serving Krishna. And Krishna is in the heart of every living entity. So Vaishnava sannyas is an opportunity for greater engagement. How? Through greater detachment. So, to put it again in one sutra, one who is detached from the world is in the best position to engage with it. And to the degree that we cultivate vairagya of heart, to that degree we can actually serve others. To that degree we can preach, to that degree we can teach, to that degree we can engage, to that degree we can serve. And this is how to distinguish, this is an aside, this is how to distinguish between real renunciation and false renunciation. If you find someone who's so renounced that they can't be bothered to, like Prabhupada used to say, right? Like many people will not touch money because I'm renounced. Prabhupada said, it's okay if they don't want to touch. You bring it all here. We'll take it. Why? Because I don't need it. I'm going to engage it in Krishna's service. Swamiji, why are you building all these big temples? Right? Such glorious temples. Prabhupada said, we are very happy to worship Krishna under a tree. The 6 Goswamis did this. But you will not come. Right? You will not come to join us under a tree. So therefore, we will use Krishna's energy in Krishna's service. Not in my service, but in Krishna's service. So, this is how we can distinguish false and real renunciation. When renunciation leads to the depersonalization of others, to the mistreatment of others, to the ignoring of others for selfish advancement, that type of renunciation is not right for devotees. Nirbandha Krishna sambandhe yuktam vairagyam uchyate. Real renunciation is engaged. Questions? Okay. And then the very last one. The last building block is karma. Now, if you recall again, karma was one of the challenges, yes, of we talked about yesterday. Because it's fatalism. If it's your karma anyway, why should I help? You're meant to suffer or enjoy, as it may be. And it's all happens according to Krishna's plan. And it'll come whether you like it or not, so what's the point? I think this is a great misunderstanding, or misuse, shall we say, of karma. Karma has two sides to it. Karma means action, and it means reaction. What's the primary meaning of karma? Action. Right? Krishna says, the way Krishna uses it in Bhagavad Gita, 9 times out of 10, action. Karmanyeva adhikaraste ma phaleshu kadacha. You have a right to do your karma, to act in this world. But the phala, the reaction, is not in your hands. So, karma has these two sides. Both are valid, action and reaction. And both are useful, but in different ways. One focuses on what you can do and what you can change, and the other is what you cannot change, what you cannot affect, because it's meant to come to you. The first one, both are useful at different times in our life. Okay? There are times when we need to make peace with our situation, and we need to accept it because it's part of our lot in life, right? It's the toolkit that we were born with. I was never good at sports, and I've come to realize I'll never will be, right? It's just not part of the package I have in this life, right? My body doesn't work in that way, or maybe I don't have an interest or whatever, right? It's just not there. So, okay, I resign myself. That's part of my karma. Oh, that's a very easy example. We go through a lot more in life, right? We suffer diseases that cannot be cured. We end up in situations that we cannot find escape from. There are times when the other side of karma is actually very helpful for us to recognize that there are some things that are not in my control. And I should not blame myself for them. I should not blame God for them. It is just the way things are. And I can make peace with it. But there are other times in life when we need karma in the primary sense, which is in the sense of action. Namely, that whatever might be my current situation, I have the capacity to change my future. I have the capacity to do something to affect my future and the people I am responsible for. When you see someone being attacked on the street, or someone walking out in front of a bus, which aspect of karma should you use? The action, right? You don't want to be like, oh, that's his karma, walking out in front of a bus? Interesting, I wondered what he did to deserve that. No! That goes against basic humanity, right? You have to use the first element. I have an opportunity to change this person's future. As in, they can live if I just pull them out from the bus or I shout at them. Watch where you're going. Here's the key thing. Karma has both sides. Both can be useful in our life. When we are applying karma to someone else, we only have the right to apply the first. To ask ourselves, how can I do something to help them? And how can I inspire them to do something to help themselves? We don't have the right to say, oh, it's your karma, deal with it. Right? Like maybe if you have such a close relationship with someone, that you really, really are deeply connected to them, you might have the privilege of saying, I think you have to make peace with your situation. Right? Maybe. But you really have to have a great degree of trust to be able to say that to someone. For the vast majority of people in this world, no. Our goal is not to disempower them, but to empower them to improve. And so if we go back to the story of Narada Muni where we started, when he comes to Mrigadi and he tells him about the law of karma, what side of karma does he use? Does he tell him, my gosh, Mrigadi, I have no idea what you did in your last life to be born like this, as a hunter who takes pleasure in the suffering of other animals? look at your condition. I hope you get a better birth next time. No, imagine what that would have done to Mrigadi. He would have been totally crushed. Here's your future, and there's nothing you can do to change it, because that's your past. When he meets Mrigadi, he does not focus on Mrigadi's past, which was definitely not good. He had done this for a lifetime, at least, of giving animals pain. What he focuses on is the future. He empowers Mrigadi through the idea of karma. He says, you have the capacity to improve your life, your lot. And in the process, you have the capacity to improve the life of all these poor animals too. Imagine what you can do, how much power you have. And that's what inspires him to change his ways. So karma is a double-edged sword. It can prevent our engagement if we make it fatalistic, or it can provide a foundation for engagement if we see karma as something that empowers us and others. Okay. 8 building blocks. The world is a miserable place, yet Krishna finds good reason to try to fix it over and over again, and if it's good enough for him to do, it's good enough for us. This world is imperfect, but it's not different from Krishna, and therefore still wonderful. It's divine, in fact. And because it's not different from Krishna, and because Krishna is a person, therefore he truly does understand the suffering, the trouble that we and devotees and every living being goes through. Krishna is personal, the world is non-different from Krishna, therefore the world is a personal place. And when we apply the Vaishnava philosophy, Mahaprabhu's philosophy of radical personalism, then everything can be engaged in a relationship. And when we engage in a relationship, then that is the foundation for an ethic of care. That we can care for the world. Jai Shri Bodhikai Ki Jai. Then engagement begins with personal transformation, a transformation of character, of which the most important thing is paradukha, a devotee's ethic of compassion, where we put the regular morals and put them on steroids. Not just dharma, but seva. Not just ahimsa, but karuna. We talked about detachment, vairagya, and how the best position to engage with the world is when we're disengaged from it, when we're detached from it. And finally, the double-edged sword of karma. Okay? I want to end by a couple of practical thoughts. What can we do? What can we do as individuals? What can we do as a community? If we try to bring these rather grand philosophical ideas and we try to bring them into a more individual, personal, immediate light, how best can we apply these principles in our communities to affect change? How can we assist Krishna and our acharyas in the work that they want to do in this world? How can we be part of Krishna's team? The first general principle is to think locally. Sometimes the grand problems of the world are too grand. They're too big. They can inspire us or demoralize us. And it can be a lot to try to think, I'm going to solve everything. We can't. But each one of us knows what are the challenges in our own communities, in our own environments. I live in Utah, and there one of the biggest challenges we are facing is the drying up of the Great Salt Lake. You know, you've heard of Salt Lake City. The reason it's called that is because we have the largest inland salty body of water in the United States. And far from being worthless, this body of water is key to the survival of the entire state. If that water were to dry up, which it 2 years ago, we were about 6 months away from it going extinct. Now it's replenished a little bit. But if this water were to dry up, it would raise so much arsenic and other heavy metals into the air from the dust that has been settled for years, that it would pollute the environment enough that it would cause widespread disease, cancer and sickness and toxic and respiratory issues and so on, which is already the case, unfortunately, but not to the extent that it could be. It's a huge problem in the state. The government, every university, you have to be really asleep to not notice that this is a big topic of conversation. My university in particular has held panels of scientists and theologians, religionists, and natural resource people, everyone to come together to try to solve the issue. As Vaishnavas, as followers of Mahaprabhu, we have something very important to contribute to this discussion. The causes, the sources of that depletion, how we change it, how we affect it. This is a conversation that we can be part of. And people really appreciate the distinctiveness of the perspective that we bring to the table. And as we participate in those conversations, then we're invited to actually participate in the solutions as well. Right? What are those issues in your community? Is it environmental? Is it political polarization? What is it? And how can we bring a spiritual solution to that material problem? And in this way demonstrate the relevance of Krishna consciousness in an authentic way. Secondly, we have to, once we know what the issues are, then we need to educate ourselves. To say, what are solutions that have been presented already? What's missing from those discussions? Who within the larger community has studied this? Who amongst the Vaishnava community can offer something? We have professionals in every area we can think of. We have hydrologists and engineers and doctors and artists, and we have everything within our communities. Who's there? Who can provide a Vaishnava perspective? What does Shastra have to say about it? So we begin from a place of knowledge, rather than just jumping in and, like I said earlier, someone's presenting something and say, oh yeah, Krishna says that too. Right? No, let's start by thinking through the problem, the challenge. And if you're going to university or to high school now, right, you know these problems, these questions come up over and over and over again in your classes. Everyone's looking for solutions, and they're looking for good ideas. Your papers, right, that professors ask you to write, these are opportunities to provide a distinctively Krishna-conscious, grounded, practical response to the challenges. And finally, we start with small and practical steps. Find partners in the community that we can work with, whatever your field might be. Right? Whatever your field might be. I think one of the best examples of this I find in ISKCON is the National Yatra of the United Kingdom. In England, they've done a very good job of becoming part of these sorts of conversations at every level of government and society and community. And participating on everything from neighborhood levels, discussions, to national level, advisory boards to the Prime Minister. Just by taking small, practical steps. If you're in the world of finance, then how about developing an instrument, an investment vehicle that invests in companies that are dharmic in their overall ethos, so that devotees don't have to invest their retirement savings in companies that promote the things that we object to, the four regulative principles, right? That don't invest in things that exploit animals or exploit other human beings or promote illicit sex or gambling or intoxication of various kinds. Why not use that skill as an opportunity to offer a service to the world and to the devotee community? If we are doctors, if we are lawyers, or whatever there might be, there are ways to affect change within our own sphere, because no one can do it all. But like I started, as I said at the beginning of the seminar, all of us are engaged anyway. Every day we go to work or to school, we are forced to engage. We have to engage. That's how we get our paycheck. Why not be thoughtful about how I can do the same thing as a devotee and go one step further than the minimum that's required of me by saying, I can do more as a Vaishnava in this situation. That's all it takes. It's not a whole recalibration, re-strategization. It's not a change of philosophy. No. It's just taking what we're doing anyway and asking ourselves, how can we do this in a thoughtful, Krishna-conscious way? Drawing on the foundations of our philosophy, drawing on Srimad Bhagavatam. What do I have to contribute, to offer? Because when people see devotees acting as devotees in any sphere, they respect that. They recognize that, yes, we're all doing the work, but there's something different about this person. What are they bringing to the table? And they appreciate that. So ultimately it means us owning our identity as devotees, inhabiting that identity. Owning it not just in the temple, because here it's easy to be a devotee. That's the point of the temple, to make it easy. So that's not a bad thing, that's the whole purpose. But the other purpose of the temple is for us to take what we get here and then live it out there. And that's the sum and substance of what engaged Vaishnavism is. It's ensuring that we're not living two lives. We're not devotees here and then just a doctor, just an IT specialist out there. No, I'm a devotee here and I'm a devotee out there. And I'm going to bring my Krishna-conscious perspective to the work that I do. Okay, that's it. Thank you all so very much for your attention. Okay, so we have a little time for questions, and there's a lot of hands. So let's start from the left and move to the right. Okay, I see 4 hands so far. Yes.
Thank you for such a nice class, Prabhu, and thank you for coming. At least come twice a year. So, I have exactly opposite question of this Murari incident. That Narad Muni, as we pray to Damodar every year, like 9 Damodar Ashtakam, it says that as the 2 sons of Kuvera and Manigriva and Nalakuvera were delivered from curse of Narad, right, and made into great devotees. So, there Narad Muni cursed them outright, right? And here he protected Murari. So how do we look at these 2 situations?
Yes.
Totally different situations.
Wonderful question. So the question, if you weren't able to hear in the back, is basically how do we talk about this other instance from Narada Muni's life when he curses the 2 sons of Kuvera, Manigriva and Nalakuvara. Right away, he curses them. Whereas with Mrigadi, he spends all this patient time, helping him step by step, kill the animals fully, then don't kill them, then I'll bring you food. And with Nalakuvara and Manigriva, it's like, boom, right? In both, he's doing the same thing, right? He's reforming, he's offering an opportunity for improvement for both of them. But back to our point about audience that we were talking about yesterday. In both cases, the audience is very different. In the case of Nalakuvara and Manigriva, they are sons of demigods. They're sons of Kuvera. Kuvera is one of the greatest of the devas. They've received all the training, all the knowledge in the world. They've received all the good association. They've had the perfect upbringing. They've had all the wealth they need. There's nothing wrong with their life. And yet they are misbehaving. So what they needed is someone to shake them up and say, wake up, what are you doing? Don't you know? And they recognize it, right? They immediately understand, or maybe it takes them a little time as trees to understand, but they get it. And with Mrigari, he was in a very different situation. He was someone who had none of the privileges that Nalkuvar and Manigriv had. He did not have a good education, or any education, outside of his training in hunting. He did not have wealth outside of his furs. He did not have any sort of resources. He was not from great parentage. He had no access to teachers. He had none of that, right? So advancement, this is the thing, advancement in Krishna consciousness is relative to where we're at already. And for every person, that looks different. Sometimes, as we're engaging with others, we often keep the same endpoint for everyone. Right? We think, if everyone comes to the point of Diksha, then okay, then I have succeeded. But the reality is, for someone, just killing the animals fully can be progress on the path of bhakti. And for someone else, Diksha is the natural next step, because they've been doing this already for many lifetimes. So every person, every situation is different. And this is what makes Narad Muni so special as a devotee, as the ideal engaged Vaishnava, is that he's able to relate to each person according to what they need in their situation. Nalkuvar and Manigriv needed this, and the result was glorious because they saw Krishna face to face. Mrigari needed this. King Prachina Barhi needed a long story. Right? He tells them this beautiful allegory of Puranjana, and it's a thinly veiled allegory. Right? It's all about his own life, and he's teaching him like that. And to everyone. And Kansa, he uses a totally different approach. Right? He'll go to the demons, he'll flatter them for how intelligent they are and how powerful they are and how they need to do this and this, and they trust him. Right? So, different people, different approaches. He probably knew Nalkuvar Manigriv as children also. He's Devarshi. These are boys he has known, right? So he also probably had a very personal connection with them. Like, in other words, he was able to go to them and say, "Kya kar rahe ho?" Like, what's this? You know, like a kid that you know, and you know they can do better. It's like, what's up? You know, I've known you, I've taught you, you know better than this. Right? That's his mood with Nalkuvar and Manigriva. Because he's Devarshi, he knows Kuvera, he knows Indra, he knows all of these people. Okay, Mataji, and then, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Prabhuji, for the wonderful lecture. I have a question about the action and reaction, and I'm going to use your example, like you said, that I accepted the fact that my body is just not meant for sports in this lifetime, so I'm going to accept the reaction.
Yes.
So when do you get to that point to accept that whatever actions you're doing, that it's just not meant to be?
Yes, very good question. When do you come to a point where you know that you have to resign to something rather than change it? We go through a lifetime of self-discovery, of who we are, right? Prabhupada calls this the journey of self-discovery. This is a journey, it's not a moment where we go, oh, this is what my toolkit is. Everyone comes into this world with a toolkit. Right? Someone gets a saw and someone gets a chisel, but you didn't get the screwdriver, you didn't get the hammer, right? There's some things you get, some things you don't. But it takes a whole lifetime to figure that out, to say, actually this is what I'm good at and this is what I'm not. And it changes in the course of a lifetime. Right? We discover, because we're changing. This material body is changing. We're growing as spirit souls. So we also discover new abilities. We say, yeah, actually I didn't know, I didn't think I could do that, but I can. And this is where a community approach is very important. even though it's a journey of self-discovery, trying to figure ourselves out on our own is notoriously difficult because we misunderstand ourselves more than we misunderstand others. We say, no, that's not in my toolkit. I can't do public speaking, right? When we don't realize that all that speaking is fear. Actually, we do have the capacity, but we didn't realize it. It's very difficult for us to distinguish what counts as capacity and what counts as simply fear or lack of training, right? Lack of opportunity. Many things can lead to something missing. So this is where we really need help from those who are mentors and well-wishers, or in Sanskrit, shiksha gurus, right? People who we trust enough, and they trust us enough, so that we can take good feedback from them. And they can say, yeah, Radhika Raman, I don't think you're going to ever be a great basketball star, but you ought to try cooking, because even though you think you can't cook, I think you can. Right? So that's something we often learn in conversation with others. Of course, we can't go too far down that route as well. Like, people often tell us things about ourselves that are patently false because they have other motivations. Right? They put us down, or they say they glorify us to the skies, and we don't have that capacity. So that's why it's important to have people we can actually trust, from whom we can take both the good and the bad, because we know that they have our best interests in mind. Yes, we trust them enough.
Prabhuji, the way you spoke and made the presentation proves that you have knowledge. Now, to take advantage of your knowledge more for the benefit of the devotees, I just ask you about three things. They are invisible, they are intangible. They are with the human being. One is mind, the other is intelligence, and the third is consciousness. Can you please explain as to what do they mean?
So this is a little bit off topic, but I'll try to say it in brief. Okay, mind and intelligence are part of our subtle body. So there's the physical body, sthula sharira, then there's the subtle body, it's called sukshma sharira. And this subtle body is material. It's not spiritual in nature, it's material still. But as you said, it is intangible. The function of the mind is thinking, feeling, and willing. Right? It's the seat of the senses. There's the seat of desires. The function of the intelligence is to provide us perspective through the power of discernment between good and bad, between right and wrong. That broader perspective is given by intelligence. The mind is where the desires and the plan making occurs. Right? So plans need motivation. They need direction. That direction comes from the intelligence. Okay? And consciousness is a symptom of the Atma, of the soul. It is what distinguishes life from death, from living things, from material things. Right? So that consciousness means self-awareness, the ability to be aware first of ourselves and then of other things. Yes? So there's much more to be said, but I'll speak briefly on this topic.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Prabhuji, for the class. So, when you spoke about detachment as a way of helping people, or when you're truly detached, that's when you actually truly feel you're truly qualified to help. But there is also the other spectrum that you truly don't care anymore. So how do you kind of balance?
Yes, very good question. There's the other aspect where you don't care anymore. And what I was trying to say is that is not detachment. Not according to a Vaishnava perspective. There is a big difference between detachment and indifference. Indifference means I don't care. Detachment means that I'm willing to set aside my personal interest for you because I care so much. You see the big difference? And so, too often we confuse indifference with detachment when the two are worlds apart. When someone's detachment is immature, then it manifests as indifference. Right? And initially, when we practice Krishna consciousness, we can feel a sense of detachment that's very intense. but often it is not detachment, but a sense of indifference. I can't deal with it, right? And it's a sense of escapism from the world. I'm going to run away. I'm going to give up everything. So we become frustrated with something, right? We have a big fight at home. I'm going to take sannyas, right? No, that's not detachment, right? That's a sense of frustration. And so indifference, frustration, fear, all of these can manifest in ways that look like detachment to someone who is not careful in distinguishing them. But the way to distinguish proper detachment is that it makes us more attached to the idea of serving Krishna, and because we're serving Krishna, therefore of giving our life in service to everyone related to Krishna, that is, to all living entities. Yes, Shamkund Prabhu, and then here.
So Prabhu, thank you. So yesterday we started the class, right, saying that the world is looking for a solution. The world is looking for all religion to give us a solution which is right now, not the future life. Right? Even you said university students are looking for engagement, not the futuristic side. So when we say solution, right, when the world is looking for, they are looking for something which can be measured, tangible, right? So there's some metrics. So there are certain actions you can measure it. For example, food for life, we can measure it. Or some religions do schools or the hospitals, we can measure it. But I had a difficulty measuring the 8 blocks what you presented today. For example, number 6 says that transformation of character. Number 7 says detachment. So how do you measure it, and how does the world say this is the real solution?
Yes, very good question. How are these things measurable? How does the world see that there are real solutions? So a couple things I want to say on this. Very, very good point. So one thing is that, so I was on a panel recently where we were discussing both air pollution and the drying up of the Great Salt Lake in Utah. This was at Utah State University. So I was there with a water scientist and a air quality scientist and a social scientist. And then I was the religionist, or the religious studies professor. And one of the things that kept coming up over and over again in the panel was that the science is clear. We know exactly what we need to do in order to clean up the air quality and to save the Great Salt Lake. We know exactly what needs to be changed, what needs to be developed. We need, all the metrics are crystal clear. The problem is, how do we get human beings to change their behavior and their attitude so that we can achieve those metrics? The problem is not a scientific one, it's a human one. And this is something we saw in the pandemic as well. That the challenges were all human in nature. Should we do this? Should we do that? Do we do this? Do we do that? It was not scientific. We understood the virus very early on very well. Right? But how do we as human beings navigate it? What are the values that we want to put front and center first? It's all a question of values. So my first response is to say, I don't think we should give up so easily. This is more practical than it looks. People today do recognize that what we're looking for is a change in values. And when I offer that in whatever humble way I could, so many people came afterwards and said, yes, this is what we need. Right? Like, if we don't stop misusing or using through so much factory farming, so much quantities of water, through a change of our behavior and our lifestyle, things are not going to change. No matter how much we properly measure the input and the output of water into and out of the lake. It's primarily a change in lifestyle, which requires a change in perspective. Right? When we talk about corporations and their misuse of resources, all the numbers are clear. But what's behind it that we cannot change is the mentality of greed, right? Of this capitalist, over-consumerist idea. Let's maximize profits at whatever cost. That's a values question. It's not a question of metrics. So that's one thing, is that I think we really have to not be ashamed of the fact that we're offering a change in perspective that is not always measurable and yet is very impactful. That's one thing. The other thing, on a slightly humbler note, is to say, I'm a humanities person, a philosopher, theologian, religious studies type person. This is what I have to offer. It is up to all of us, I hope, up to all of you in your respective fields, to take these values and make them measurable. Make them practical. Right? Like the one example I gave you, there's at the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies, there's an affiliated project to create a Dharma index. This is a mutual fund index that invests only in things that are dharmic, largely speaking. Right? This is a practical, measurable thing. You can actually measure how that index is performing and who it's useful for and what your market is. That's not something I could come up with at all, but someone who is an expert in that field could, right? So this, in some ways, this presentation is an invitation to say, yes, let's make this more practical in your respective fields. The way I can make it practical is by educating students, right? By teaching students and impressing upon them that what we need is a change in values. But each of you are in your own fields of work. And so the question really is, how can you make it measurable in your area of work? I can measure it in the realm of teaching. I can see the impact on my students. I can see the careers they're wanting to go on. How can you see it in your field, in your line of work? And that's not actually in my capacity to offer, because it's something that we need to do as a group within each of our respective areas of expertise. So yes, it's a little bit nebulous, but that's kind of the world that I inhabit. Yeah. So yes, Prabhu.
Well, aside from the fact that it was a wonderful presentation, I really appreciated the fact that you chose such a relevant and important topic. So I appreciate that. My question was addressing possible dangers that as neophytes we may face in trying to do engaged Vaishnavism. And here's two examples. Prabhupada, when he came to this country, it was the Vietnam War was a big issue, but he didn't make very much of it. So how can we be sure that we're concentrating on something worth it? And the other part of it is, if I was in the place of Narada Muni and I told Macquarie to break his bone, and he'd say, how am I going to eat? I would tell him, well, you can grow seeds, I'll help you, we'll grow seeds, we'll grow a whole, and I may become detracted from my own business. So are these two actual dangers
Yes, sure, definitely. With every service comes a risk, right? With every service comes a danger of us getting distracted, of us becoming proud, of us becoming attached in the wrong sorts of ways. So most certainly, Prabhu, and I think that's a very valuable reminder of that. Jai Shri Gaurnitai. So just on the Vietnam War point, if you recall, Prabhupada produced that leaflet at the time called the Peace Formula. You remember that? And so Prabhupada was very aware of what was happening in the Vietnam War. And he was responding to it with the Peace Formula. And then, when he spoke in Gainesville, which was a center of protest at that time, and Prabhupada directly addressed this issue. Then when he went to, when he traveled in France and in Australia, he was, I have to tell you this story. Srila Prabhupada had a very wonderful, very unique way of engaging. Right? He would address an issue head on, and he liked to prompt a reaction. Prabhupada's nature was that of a fighter. He loved a good fight, a good debate, not physically, but and the devote. I was recently earlier this year in Stockholm for a conference that was organized by a professor there, a devotee who was doing it in celebration of the 50th anniversary of Srila Prabhupada's visit to Stockholm University, where he gave a lecture there, and also at another university nearby. And it was a wonderful occasion, papers on Srila Prabhupada and talking about his history and his impact and all of that. And one of the treats was a talk from the professor who originally invited Prabhupada to his class 50 years ago at Stockholm University. And he was recounting, he's a devotee, and he was recounting the story, and he said, Prabhupada first went to meet with a group of philosophy students, PhD students and professors. And they had a very congenial discussion, respectful, about topics of dharma and philosophy and Vedanta, and they had very gentlemanly questions and so on. And Prabhupada was not satisfied. He left after that, and he leaned over to this devotee and said, "What are the Swedes interested in?" And the devotee said, "Well, Prabhupada, right now there's a big push towards political equality and communism." This was a time when it was rising in Sweden. Communism and political equality and unity. Prabhupada goes into the big lecture hall, and guess what he talks about? The Varnashram system. 4 Varnas and the head of society, and the whole room explodes in people being angry and upset. But this is why. And he's got the whole place riled up and engaged, totally into it, right? He's making his point. And then finally, it's really bubbling. The devotees are getting worried. And someone finally stands up and says, "So Swamiji, you think you must be first class, right?" And he says, "No, I am 6th class." He said, "Because I am the servant of all the other classes." And immediately everyone calms down and smiles break out. So what I mean to say is that Prabhupada was amazingly engaged, right? He had his approach, he had his technique. And this goes to your second point, which is to say, we need to know what we can do. Right? If I entered a room and did that, it's over. Not only a future invitation's gone, but possibly career implications. Okay? I need to know my position, and I need to act accordingly. And how can I contribute? So we all need to, and that's part of honesty as a preacher. It's not just about engaged Vaishnavism, it's about book distribution, right? We need to know, can I go into that bar to distribute books? Well, if I can't handle it, then don't go, right? It's not good association, and if you go, then it's not their fault, it's our fault for not thinking through this. So we need to recognize our limitations. How can we contribute, and how we need to hold back. Yeah? Okay. Nilamai Prabhu, how are we doing? I see a couple more hands, but I don't want to delay people or stretch. Is it okay? Okay. Yes.
Hare Krishna Prabhuji, this question might sound a little silly. On the 8 foundations, the first point is the world is a miserable place. And the third one was the world is non-different from God. If it is non-different from God, why is it miserable?
Yes. If the world is non-different from God, why is it miserable? This is not at all a silly question. This is probably the most difficult question in the history of theology of any religion. Any theistic system has to ask this question. It's called, in Western philosophy, it's called the problem of evil. Why, if God is all good and the world is his creation, why is there such a miserable world? Right? This is the fundamental question that every religious tradition has struggled with, including ours. This is the question that Bhishma Dev asks on his deathbed in front of Krishna. He says, "Oh, you Pandavas, you don't deserve to suffer the way you did. You are friends of Krishna, and look at what you had to go through. Why is this the case?" And he offers different options, right? Different possibilities. So this is a very, very big, very difficult question. But in simple, we have the fundamental principle of karma, right? That the world is set into motion by the Lord, and he gives us permission within bounds to do what we want. And then we can create a very wonderful space from it, like we do in Satya Yuga, or we can create a hellhole as well, like we do in Kali Yuga. That's up to us in terms of our actions, how we want to play in this playground that he offers us. And then more broadly speaking, this question is answered in other ways as well, by saying Krishna doesn't benefit or harm anyone. He creates a system and he gives us the rule book for the game. He says, this is how you play. Mode of goodness, these are the results. Mode of passion, these are the results. Mode of ignorance, these are the results. Now it's up to you how you want to play the game. Right? And then we make our choices. And all Krishna does is he collects like-minded people together so they can express their desires. Right? He'll help sattvic people find each other. He'll help tamasic people find each other so that they can express themselves fully. And he delays the reaction a little bit so that we can feel a sense of independence. We can feel like we got away with our misdeeds. In this way we can express that independence. So Krishna never promises an easy life for his devotees. But he does promise his protection. He promises us a way to live in this world with dignity and with a sense of purpose in our journey back home. That's what he promises us. But he never says it's going to be an easy ride. Right? So we have to hold Krishna accountable to his promises. But then we also have to be clear of what he promises us. And Krishna's promises are very clear. He says, it's not going to be easy, dukhalayam shashvatam, but I will be there with you. You will have dignity. You will have hope. You will be able to navigate it because I will be there. Yes.
Nice answer.
I just had a quick question. So it's about what you said yesterday. So yesterday, I don't know, this might be very small, but yesterday you were talking about when we engage with others, we should begin the engagement, the discussion, whatever it is, with ourselves grounded in Krishna consciousness, right? There's no need to bring in like materialistic trends or things like that, right? But then at the same time, you said that we have to create a connection with them as equals. So like for example, when you're doing book distribution or something like that, right? Like the quickest way that you can make a connection with someone in order for them to listen to you and trust you is by referencing, like, for example, if they're wearing the jersey of like a soccer team or any team, is by referencing that team or bringing in that materialistic like idea or trend or whatever, and then having a conversation, building a connection, and then going into like the Krishna conscious aspects and how that's relevant to their life. So
yes. Yeah, thank you for that question. It's basically, in short, how do we, even as we remain grounded, to what extent can we connect with people on material grounds or draw from that? And yeah, that's a very good question, and I'm glad you asked it because it requires clarification. I did not mean to suggest that we cannot take knowledge from wherever it might be found. There are, this second point of educate yourself, there are experts who have studied all of these things, and it behooves us to draw on their knowledge. What we're offering is not a reinvention of the wheel, right? I'm not going to go reinvent the chemical composition of the Great Salt Lake and say, well, I'm going to do this on Krishna conscious terms, right? I don't know about your research. No, that's not our job, right? That's been done well. What we have to offer is a Krishna conscious perspective that can help us better understand, interpret all that body of research, to understand it with fresh vision, with a new set of values, right? So Krishna consciousness is offering an overlay on the knowledge that is already present. So that knowledge, those facts, are very useful and they're important, and it's important to respect someone who has it and to connect with them on that basis. My point was simply, then what is it that we can offer as devotees to that conversation? Not to reject, but to add, right? And Srila Prabhupada says this very nicely in this quote that was part of the youth thing that we did just before this, which I'll read out because I liked it very much. I think Akshin Gopika discovered this quote. Prabhupada says, this is Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 1, Chapter 16, Text 6 in the purport. He says, there is no need to eradicate politics economics, sociology, etc., which are mundane to the mundaners. To a pure devotee who is actually related with the Lord, such mundane things are transcendental if dovetailed with the Lord or with his pure devotees. So that's all we're trying to do, is take what's good out there and dovetail it with Krishna. Yeah? So our process is not one of rejection, but of addition, multiplication. Thank you. Yes?
Hare Krishna Prabhuji, it was a very nice lecture, but I was confused at the point where you said the karmic reactions of the karma, and then you said that there's two sides for karma, action and reaction. So you talked about action, how you can control, and you said both of them are useful. But how is reaction useful?
Yes, thank you. Good question. How is reaction useful on the other side? Reaction is useful because when we recognize that this is something, a reaction that is coming from my past, then we realize that this is something that I have to accept, I have to make peace with, right? Just like you and I, we both wear glasses, right? That means for our whole life, because I started when I was your age, our whole life we're going to be wearing these glasses, right? So that's something, no matter how hard how many carrots you eat, it's not going to change. Right? You can prevent further decay by eating enough carrots. So eat your carrots. But still, it's going to be with you, right? So that's reaction. So that's something you and I, we have to make peace with, right? We have to accept this is something missing. Perfect eyes are missing in my toolkit. This is not what Krishna has given me. But what he has given you, at least, is a very sharp intelligence, right? So you can use that in Krishna's service, right? So that's where you distinguish between action and reaction. Reaction is the bit that you accept. Action is the bit that I'm going to do something about. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay, good question. Thank you. Okay, yes.
Very well, Prabhuji. Once again, fantastic talk. Really, mind shifted, right? So, kind of to jump off of Sudiksha's question regarding preaching, right? When you talk about preaching and there's such an undercurrent and kind of imperative within our community, because the main goal is to propagate the teachings that we are basing our entire livelihood on, right? So when we have those kind of conversations, it is normal to kind of start at a materialistic commonality and then kind of branch into a way so that they can understand and kind of integrate the teachings that we're trying to show them, right? But then there's cases of scenarios and conversations or communities where we have to engage in a way that we can't necessarily incorporate spirituality. We can't be verse dropping and dropping out the rules of karma and things like that. So especially when we're talking to someone in a way that's either to console them or advise them or any sort of engagement, there's a removal of the philosophy, kind of like a sanitized way of engaging with them, right? Does that diminish the engagement we're doing, regardless of whether we're grounded in Krishna consciousness or not? Because we're not actively trying to incorporate and preach even on a subliminal level, because we're sanitizing to that specific person, whether atheists or people who aren't open to religion and stuff like that.
Yes. So yeah, wonderful question. There's two things I want to say. One is that the key thing is that it's grounded in Krishna consciousness. What's visible and what's grounded may be different. Sometimes we have to make things less visible because of the circumstances. It doesn't mean that Krishna consciousness therefore does not have an impact. If we change the consciousness of people, say we're having a discussion with someone, just to use a very easy example, right? And the conversation comes to the environmental impacts of meat eating or of factory farming, right? Factory farming particularly. We may not be in a situation where we can drop verses and talk about ahimsa as a value or talk about what Krishna wants to be offered in Bhagavad Gita, foods in the three modes. That may be not at all possible, right? But if that's the ground from which you are coming, as you are speaking, you are helping them advance towards Krishna. even if that advancement happens in ways that are not directly shaped by the language that we use inside the temple. And a very nice example of this, again, I keep coming back to the example of Narada Muni, that when he is preaching, because he really does, to the demons, or to someone who is not a devotee of some kind, actually, there's a better example. Bali Maharaj, when Vamanadev walks into the assembly, it says that Bali Maharaj immediately wants to offer him his obeisances, like he wants to do dandavas. But he's not able to do that because he's in an assembly of demons, for whom Lord Vishnu is their sworn enemy. So he offers obeisances in his mind. And later on, when he's all tied up by the Lord, he tells Krishna with this heart full of gratitude, he says, "You are so wonderful, my Lord, that even though I was not able to physically offer you my obeisances, you still accepted my obeisances within the heart and gave me the reward for it by putting me under the shelter of your lotus feet." Right? Narada Muni finds himself in similar situations. He can't give explicit Krishna consciousness to Kansa, but he never loses sight of the fact that he needs to get this living entity to advance. So that's one thing, is it explicit or implicit? Makes very little difference. It's like fire. You touch it, it's going to heat you. It's going to burn, right? It doesn't matter whether it's visible or it's invisible. It's hot, whether it's red hot or it's not. It's going to have its effect. That's one thing. The other thing is a devotee's primary mode of teaching in any situation is character. Is when a devotee enters a situation, when Narada Muni comes in front of Mrigari, why is Mrigari not able to speak foul language to him? That's his habit, but he's not able to do it because he sees this person and he says, I don't know, there's something about him that I need to respect. And as devotees, this is something that we can experience every day in our workplace. Right? We can be different through our character. And people know that there's something different about this person. When I need shelter, I want to come to them. And it's very interesting, devotees in their workplaces, school places, everywhere, become sources of shelter. People come for refuge when they're distressed, when they're confused, when they need a balanced opinion, because they recognize that this person somehow has their balance. Right? They're not as prone to these big, vast variations and emotions and viewpoints. They seem to be really grounded. I don't know what it is, or I kind of know what it is, but I don't really want to ask about it. But there's something worth taking shelter of here. And people are drawn to that. They want to seek refuge. And so as devotees, I've spoken to so many devotees about this, and I've experienced this myself also. Like, regardless of what area they're in, they're often in a role of providing solace to others, of providing guidance, of providing direction. They're not managers. I mean, they could be, but even if they're not managers, or they're not in a formal position of authority, somehow they do that. Because people know that this person has character. They have something worth giving. And they will, I can talk to them and they won't be trying to use me in some way. Right? And that's the definition of trust. So that's the foundation, right? As Mahaprabhu said, first achar, then prachar. Right? That's the foundation of how we engage. And then whatever we can add implicitly to that, great. And as time goes on, we'll be able to add more explicitly as well. And that's even better. Yes.
Prabhu, I have one selfish question for you. So this engaged Vaishnavism, right? It looks like one needs to have a knowledge of the scriptures, not only our scriptures, other scriptures, what are the real problems and all these things. In your position, I can see that you have that expertise and you are able to apply that in your field of teaching and education. I'm still struggling, how can I do that myself? So my selfish question to you is there any possibility you writing a book or something? Which is like engage Vaishnavism for dummies, something like that. Training professionals so the hotel owners and others can utilize.
So it's so nice, Prabhu, that you say that. I really take it as your blessings, as Prabhupada's blessings speaking through you, because it's something that I've been meditating on for a long time. It's a book that I would publish both for academic audiences and for devotee audiences. It would be a bridge. And I've not been able to make... I've been doing a lot of thinking in this area, but I haven't been able to put a lot down on paper because I'm in this currently this management role in the university, administrative role. It's been taking a lot of time. But Krishna willing, this administrative role will not last forever. Most people do it for 5 years or so. I've done it for 3 now. So with getting a little bit more space and time, then this is, again, Krishna willing, it's my next book project. The next thing I'd like to do is to write with theology. Okay, Prabhu, there's 2 more, but again, I can stay here all night, but I think devotees have probably hungry and so what do you suggest? Should we stop? Okay. Okay, 2 last questions, okay? The penultimate question.
8 point what you said, like 2 sides of karma.
Yeah?
So the 8 point, like where you said, like the 2
Yes.
sides of karma.
Yes.
See, for example, like when I use the money, like whatever I earn, okay, to Krishna's service, so okay, that could be a good thing. So when I use the money, like for example, like give some part, like known friend or a family, like who is struggling, okay, they have a health issue, like okay, if I give that money, so that time, okay, they may not be a devotee, but yes, surely they are in trouble, but they expect like, okay, something, okay, I should give. So that time, it's my mind, like I'm still struggling, like should I give it, is it right? So is that I'm going to take some karma on it, or it is good, like, okay, because I know them very well, so they are in need, so how do I react to it?
Yeah. So thank you, that's a genuine question. During the pandemic, we had someone who we knew very well in the local community, and she was really struggling with just everything, particularly financially. And we had known her for some good time, and she had, a family she was taking care of, and she was... So, anyway, as a result of that relationship, not something that she asked for in any way, but we just felt moved to help out. She was a neighbor, she was someone we had a relationship with, and she needed some help, so we helped her. And that help for me was not so much like, well, okay, now are you going to become a devotee or not, right? It was just a matter of being paradukha dukhi, right? Of being someone who was helpful. Now, the result of that, though, just to put it in very pragmatic terms, right? The result of that was that we developed a very nice, lasting relationship that led to so many wonderful conversations about Krishna. She was Catholic, and we were Krishna conscious, and she grew in her spiritual life, in her Krishna consciousness, as a result of that association. Again, that's not the expectation with which we did it, because that would be wrong, right? That's very manipulative, right? We're not into cheap conversions where we pay people to convert. No, that's not what we believe in, right? So we want to be paradukha dukhi, but we can recognize that, again, because of the fact that we are devotees, therefore everyone we touch should become more Krishna conscious. That's our responsibility. That's not their responsibility, that's ours. And if we embody that Krishna consciousness, we don't have to be pure devotees, but if we embody something about Krishna consciousness, just by virtue of the fact that we are devotees, we will affect them and uplift them spiritually, right? So that's the consideration we have to look at. Now, of course, we have to be intelligent. Shastras say that if we're giving money and that money is going to be misused, and we are complicit in that, either because of negligence or because of foolishness, we give someone and we know that there's a great potential that they're going to misuse it, then yes, we will have to share in the reaction. But remember this, as devotees, we never act out of fear of karma. Krishna says very clearly, he says, that this is not something for devotees to fear about. Kinkula Shekhara, he says this in Mukundamala Stotra. He says, whether it's the dangers of hell or the pleasures of heaven, I don't care. Right? I don't care. This is not, I don't worship you out of fear of that reaction. That is for the karmakandis. The karmakandis, those who are ritualistic, they do every action out of fear of the reaction. If I do this, it is a pious reaction. If I do this, it is an impious. No. For us, the guarantor of the system is Krishna. He is in our heart. He understands if we're trying to act with the best of our ability. He describes in Bhagavad Gita how he wants us to give charity. What is charity in the mode of goodness? And if we try our best to follow that, then Krishna will take care of the rest. We don't have to act in fear, right? We just have to act with the best possible attempt to serve Krishna in the process. So we see another living entity as part and parcel of Krishna. We respond to them as a Vaishnava, paradukha dukhi, and in the process, we help them as devotees to be more Krishna conscious, if nothing else by virtue of our association. And that is enough, right? Then the result is up to Krishna. If he wants to give us bad karma, so be it, right? Devotee does not mind. Right? Our job is to serve him. Yes?
So probably this is a little bit personal question for you.
Uh-oh.
So Prabhuji, you go to so many places and preach, and you have children and family.
New Jersey is definitely my favorite. Is that what you're asking? No. Okay.
So the question is, how do you balance your sadhana?
Yeah.
Because you have so many hats.
Yes. Yeah, and it's very challenging. It's very challenging. It's a constant struggle. It's a constant attempt to do better, right? I once asked this very question of my spiritual master, Hanumat Prishaka Swami. I said, Guru Maharaj, how do I do my sadhana better in the face of all these responsibilities? I said, I want to try harder. And he told me, no, don't try harder. He said, try better, try smarter. And what he meant to say is that Krishna doesn't ask us to kill ourselves in his service, because he needs us to serve him, right? He just wants us to act smartly. And so what happens is that over time, I overcommit. At work, full-time job. At home, full-time job. As an ISKCON devotee, full-time job, right? So you've got 3 full-time jobs and you end up overcommitting in one or the other. Usually because of good reasons, right? You feel like you want to help. You feel like you have a duty. You feel like it's not for, gross material reasons. I'm going to make more money, I'm going to get more position. It's just like you want to do your best and you want to reach out, you want to help. But one thing to remember, this is the other thing my Guru Maharaj has been so helpful with. He says, remember in Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, Bhoktaram yakya tapasam sarvaloka maheshwaram surhidam sarvabhutanam. The first 2 are easier for us to understand as devotees. Krishna is the owner. This is not mine, and he teaches us this. We give in charity, we train ourselves. Bhoktaram yakya tapasam. Sarvaloka maheshwaram, same point, right? The one that is more difficult to overcome is surhidam sarvabhutanam. And he reminds me regularly, Radhika Raman, you are not the friend of the whole universe. Krishna is. Do what you can for his service. but don't drown yourself in the process. There's a very nice, there's a movie by Monty Python. You know Monty Python films? Anyway, there's classic comedy sketches. And there's one they call The Life of Brian. This is a spoof on the life of Jesus. So essentially, if you know Jesus' life, there's this regular guy named Brian, and he goes through his life, and people accidentally think he's a prophet. And he's trying to avoid it, but they come around and they'll raise, he loses a slipper and they pick it up and they say, a sign from God. And they come to his door and his mother opens. They go, Mary, Mother of God. And he turns into this prophet even though he's just Brian. And one time I was getting ready to give a seminar, and my Guru Maharaj called that morning. And he said, Radhika Raman, you know this film, Life of Brian? I said, yes. And he said, just remember, you're not Jesus, you're Brian. And for me, that's something I remind myself every single time I get up to speak. It's like, you're not Jesus, you're Brian. Jesus can be Suridam Sarvabhutanam, not me. I'm just Brian, right? So we have to be able to recognize our capacity. And that's personally a challenge for me, to say, this is my capacity, and beyond this, I'm going to harm myself and the people that I'm responsible for. So I have to draw this boundary. I can't say yes to that, right? I have to do, so that I have some space for my own Krishna consciousness, for my own sadhana, for my own practice. So it's a learning process. It's a learning process.
So we accept with the element of the
Thank you all so very much for your attention. I leave early tomorrow morning. Unfortunately, because of a commitment tomorrow evening in Utah, then I can't stay for the Sunday feast. So I will miss your association there. But thank you so much for spending yesterday evening with me and today evening and all the other times we've had for conversation. Like I said at the beginning, this really feels like home to me. Not work, but home. And it's been so wonderful coming here over the years. Thanks to Nilamani Prabhu always, nagging me enough, reminding me enough to bring me here. So I'm very grateful to all of you and to Prabhu.